Hello, fair citizens of Apostatopolis. I am the High Apostate, and this is honestly getting a little clusterfuckery. I've decided that the end goal is going to be to do 2 segments in an episode with a Bible study in the first segment and then an off-topic, non-directly Bible-related religious icon, concept, piece of history in the second half of the episode and bring them out to an hour. Before I go in and start researching for an episode, I don't have a good basis of knowledge all the time to know where I want to take it. Such as some of these Bible study episodes where I'm kind of surprised by what shows up in the Bible, or if I start doing an episode on messianic figures, I don't know everything about every messianic figure. I'm learning too. That's part of the deal here. So I need to figure out how to do that in a quantifiable way so that I have X amount of work to get done each day, because do a thing by now isn't really cutting it for me. So that's going to be the end goal. Until then, the episodes are going to be coming out bi-weekly. I can't promise what pattern they'll take until I'm able to get that workflow pegged down. But I thank you for hanging with me while I reposition my professional life and figure out a good landing point. It feels like I've been doing this for a long time to be still trying to figure it out, but it's been a few months. But it's only a couple dozen episodes in, and I'm still learning the game, realistically. I do promise that the show will find a forever format, and I do want to say thank you for sticking with me. I'm kind of going back to the format it had when I did the first run of a podcast, which just proved overwhelming. So that, but downsized, I think is going to end up working the best. Unrelated, my meds have been increased, so that is going to help with the workflow situation. I'm feeling a lot better. I'm able to focus a lot more. For people who don't know, I have been dealing with ADHD issues. I've recently been able to get into a therapist. For the last couple of months, I've been on medication. And next quarter, I am taking philosophy of religion to finish rounding out my degree. So there may be a little more, you know what this fucking guy wrote, what an asshole, instead of the usual push the randomizer button on my list of deep dive questions and messianic figures. But on to the show. So we pick up on Genesis 24, near the end of Abraham's life, with Abraham's oldest servant, and I assume this has to do with how trustworthy or dependable he is, the fact that we're being told he's Abraham's oldest servant. Maybe he's been around the longest, or maybe he's just a very elderly man. And he's being asked to promise Abraham something. So Abraham asks the servant to place his hand under Abraham's thigh, and I was curious why this was the case. So in reading commentaries and blogs, found that the word translated here into thigh is sometimes translated as loins. So the servant places his hands under Abraham's balls. Taylor Marshall says that it may have something to do with testicles and testimony having the same Latin root, and that is true, which is a interesting thing all on its own. But the odds of the Semitic patriarch doing something because of the language of an Italian series of tribes that might have been extant at this point seems like a huge stretch. There is a much more likely explanation, and one that comes from places like Cambridge instead of a guy's blog. This explanation is just that balls were a big deal when it came to making promises dealing with someone's kid. We can infer that they were aware of semen's role in pregnancy from the story of Onan, which we'll be getting to later. The short version is that he didn't want to get his dead brother's wife pregnant, so he pulled out, and God was pissed. So my thought, and this seems to be backed up by some pretty big-brain people, is that swearing on crotches is just how you made promises dealing with people's kids. Or potential kids. You cup parts, you cut parts off. That's what lets people know you mean what you say about what's coming out of there. Also, everyone knows you made a promise because it's sweaty, Bronze Age old man nuts, and that is a smell that is not coming off. So back to the ball cupping. The servant was a guy named Eliezer, who was a named character later, but it's not particularly important right now. What's important right now is that Abraham tells Eliezer that under no circumstances will Isaac be marrying a Goyim. Eliezer is to go to Abraham's family in Abraham's country and get a wife from there, and also under no circumstances is Isaac allowed to go. It's kind of a weird situation when you think about it for more than half a second. And Eliezer had kind of an important question about this, though, because what if he finds somebody and she doesn't want to come back? It doesn't really seem at this point like Abraham would be above kidnapping some poor random woman and dragging her back to Canaan, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure it's out of character for him either. But Abraham tells Eliezer that if he finds someone and she doesn't want to come back, then Eliezer is released from the promise, which also seems like giving up super fast. Like, how about just trying some? Not even a lot, but just like asking a second person? Then maybe I'm just being too generous, assuming that there's going to be any asking done. Spoiler, not really. So then it's fast forwarding to Eliezer and Abraham's 10 camels in the city of Nahor in Mesopotamia. And when they got there, they rolled up on a well, which makes sense. It was a really long walk. And I have no idea how many cities there were between Mamre and but I'm going to assume probably not a lot. It was at this point that Eliezer came up with a plan, and our apologist gets a little fucking weird. The plan was that Eliezer is going to hang out by a well and ask women who look single for water. Now, a woman that gave him water is apparently nice, but not extra nice enough for Isaac. Eliezer thought a woman who was nice to animals would be the only lady good enough for Isaac, and frankly, I could see it. I'm sure that I don't have the same thought processes as Eliezer, but being nice to animals is very important in a partner. Nobody wants a partner that's into torturing animals or neglecting animals, or unless you do, in which case you're a bad person and you should talk to somebody about that, because it's possible to change. But you have to want to change. Anyway, the commentary on the verse with the camels is what kills me about this. Apparently the 10 commandments are like the 10 camels. It says that God sent the Holy Spirit to find a bride for his son, and that the 10 commandments carry the special message of the bride of Christ and draws water from the well of salvation to satisfy the demands of holy law. And now, I'm just a small town podcaster, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't make any fucking sense. The way that Eliezer phrases his prayer in the book is as a request for a sign, the being nice to animals thing, which, while important, is just a way for him to know that Yahweh is signaling the right woman to marry Isaac. It has nothing to do with anything the fuck that Ray is talking about in his commentary. The bride of Christ is a metaphor for the church. It comes from Ephesians 5:22-24. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. End quote. It then talks about how men are supposed to love and clean their wives, and how marriage is one man and one woman, and that's because we're Jesus' body. Paul is not always a coherent communicator, and I say that having listened to the way I structure sentences in this podcast. So the idea that the Holy Spirit was looking for a bride for Jesus and just stumbled upon the church, and that the 10 Commandments is even vaguely related to this, is a load of crap. The Holy Spirit drinks from the well of salvation to fulfill the holy law of the 10 camel mandaments doesn't even fucking mean anything. And it's a stretch to call it related. It's just a lot of unrelated mean nothing coming from somebody who was desperate to put something in the book because they hadn't written anything in a couple of pages. And you know what? Honestly, I get that. There are some times where I say fuck that it's really out of place, but I feel like I need to, because that's my commentary. So after Eliezer gets done talking in his prayer, he sees a woman. Maybe the people who wrote this were bad at math and at continuity, and maybe she was a child, but probably the second one. More on that in a minute. So Eliezer sees this human female of indiscernible age and decides to ask her for water. Being a polite woman-child failed math test, she also offered to get water for the camels, and so Eliezer announced, "Aha, I own you now. Let's go tell the family, which is also my boss's family." So Rebecca is the daughter of Milcah and Nahor, which you might remember, but I don't doubt it by no fault of your own. I only remember this because I'm making a family tree as I go. Milcah is Abraham's niece, which means that Isaac is Rebecca's not very close, but kind of close cousin. This is for record keeping. Cousin fucking has been covered previously, and it turns out it's like socially gross, but not as detrimental to bloodlines as some people may have been led to believe me before I recorded that episode. And there is a footnote to be addressed here, a footnote so on point that I drew a farting butt in my Bible because that's all it is. I wasn't sure what else to do. It's a dumb footnote. It begins, There are times when the miraculous happens and convinces the believer that what he is experiencing could only be the hand of God. And the rest of it is basically saying that the reason that people have good things happen to them is because God lowers himself to involve man in the execution of his plans, and there's just kind of a lot of stupid dumb. The problem here is that this is a problem of goodness. How could good things happen without God in them? So shouldn't you give credit for all the good things that happen to you? Of course, that either implies the inverse, that if God existed, he and his divine plan would have some sort of responsibility for everything that sucked that happened to you too, because the other option is God is just struggling against bad things happening. Which, if that was going to be the cornerstone of the mythology, if that was going to be their answer to the problem of evil, it would just introduce a whole new kind of problem. So, like, cool, you got a good parking space at the oncologist? That was God. Oh, it's inoperable and terminal? Also God. Although the flip side of that is, oh, it's totally treatable? God. You had to walk a half-mile uphill to the door because someone designed a parking lot really stupidly on the side of a hill and zoning laws wouldn't permit them to put doors somewhere that made sense? Also God. Alternately, it could just be the fact that those things happen, that there isn't a divine plan. That's why your grandma's died, but your neighbor's grandma didn't. Sometimes grandmas die, roughly 100% of the time. Sometimes people get married. No, a lot of people get married. About half of them, according to the USA Today. And that's when women can generally say no and not just get claimed by every motherfucker with a thirsty camel. So none of this is particularly unusual. She doesn't really have the rights that would be needed to have an alternative. So, yeah, she's just nice enough to water camels with, frankly, an absurd amount of water. Camels drink 20 gallons of water a go, according to records I found in the Library of Congress. So by 10 camels, that's 200 gallons of water, times about 8 pounds a gallon is Rebecca, who is definitely not an adult, carrying 1,600 pounds of water. If we generously assume that the camels were each on, they averaged out to half empty, that's still 800 pounds of water. That is not a one-day affair for Rebecca, especially being of such an indiscernible age, which I've brought up a couple times, and I try not to bring up things that are totally irrelevant. So in Genesis 17:17, we're told that Sarah is 10 years younger than Abraham. And we're told in 21:5 that Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born, making Sarah 90. Then Sarah died at 127, making Isaac 37. Now this is where it starts getting kind of weak for me. Genesis 22 is the sacrifice of Isaac, which some rabbinical traditions have as the reason Sarah died. It was a big deal, and she couldn't handle the stress being 7 years older than God said people would be after the flood and all. The age isn't a given, though, and while it does read like it all happened one after the other, there is disagreement. So the Seder Olam says 37, and I have to take the people at Aish.com at their word because I don't read Hebrew. As far as I'm aware, they're an authority on religious Judaism of their type, and there's not a lot of scholarly knowledge on how young Rebecca was, or old she wasn't, when Isaac took over her lease. Now, this math says that Sarah died and Rebecca was born when Isaac was 37, and they got married when Isaac was 40, according to Genesis 25:20. The thing is, though, and this is important, this is incredibly important, this is the most important because it supports the point I want to make rather than the point you see a lot, because there are two other rabbinical teachings to consider. One says that she lived to be 133, and the other that she died when Jacob was returning from Haran when he was 99. Now, if she died when he was 99 at the age of 133, she would have been 34. And I know that because Aish.com told me, and also I did the math. And that all comes out of the Bereshit Rabbah, because remember, this is a rabbinical midrash thing, and again, I'll take their word for it because I don't speak Hebrew, and I don't doubt Jews about what things mean in Judaism anywhere near as much as I doubt evangelicals, because the Christians are way fucking sneakier about this shit. Now, if she was 34 when Jacob was born, the next question is, how long were she and Isaac married before Jacob and Esau were born? Now, we'll be going over this again pretty soon, because we're jumping ahead to the almost immediate future, but it's relevant now. So, Isaac was 60 when Jacob and Esau were born. So if Isaac was 60 when they're born and 40 when he got married, they would have been married for 20 years. Now, if Rebecca were 34 when her and Isaac had the boys after 20 years of marriage, then she would have been 14 when they were born. So everything is fine, right? Well, no, because it's still a 40-year-old man marrying a 14-year-old girl, and more back to the point that was being made, what 14-year-old girl can shuffle 1,600 pounds of water to camels? But how the fuck old is Rebecca? We know that the Bible wasn't complete, and it had both theodicies and midrashes written about it to try and explain things away, and we can deal with apologetics and midrashes, and eventually theodicies. These, when together, paint a pretty clear picture that this was written by different people who didn't get their numbers right. The commentaries change it, the book changes it. There's a disappointing lack of consistency in a lot of things that is easily explainable by it was written by different people in different places over the course of 500 years, and Google Docs communities weren't great for consistency in the way back when. So when you hear people saying Isaac married a 3-year-old, just put that aside. Just put that aside, because it doesn't matter. Because if we accept that Rebecca is 3, we're still entertaining the validity of the book. We're saying Rebecca was 3. We're completely putting aside the fact that various traditions have her at different ages as part of an explanatory power. So saying that Rebecca was 3 relies on making an assumption that has as much authority as an assumption that puts her at 14. And when two things have the same authority that contradict each other, that contradiction proves that that train of thought is not logically valid. So when you hear Isaac married a 3-year-old, put into your head and remember that there is actually, according to things with the same amount of authority, a contradiction there that leaves Rebecca's age up in the air. And that is kind of a fatal issue for the legitimacy of kind of a major story. So when you buy a woman, you have to meet with her current owner, which in cases such as this is your master's cousin. So Rebecca, the maybe baby, explained that she is the daughter of Bethuel, who is Milcah's son, whom she bore to Nahor. Also, they have a lot of straw, presumably a few hundred pounds, which I assume Rebecca will be juggling while on roller skates. Eliezer, I assume he's just called the man, still at this point, said a prayer thanking God and blessing his master. They then went to meet Laban, who saw Rebecca's nose ring, and I glossed over that there to address this here. Eliezer brought a nose ring and 2 bracelets, which weighed 10 shekels of gold. According to the Pulpit Bible commentary, this was an engagement thing. She was engaged to be married now, and so she needed to wear her engagement nose ring. The Benson commentary and Jamieson Fawcett Brown also agrees. They all cite the fact that when they were written, such things were still, they claim, a common tradition in Syria. I don't have the information to say if that's true or false at the moment, so I'm going to abstain on an opinion or claim and make a note to learn about it for another episode. Because conversely to these, Keel and Delish say that this was just to pay her for her generosity. So I'm definitely going to be doing some anthropologies in the future to find out, which is fine. I kind of like doing the anthropologies, especially for the podcast. What isn't fine is that when Laban wants to know what's going on, Rebecca tells him the truth, and that's generally pretty okay, but the truth is, I was nice to this dude's camels, and his master's son owns me now. The expedience of this is explained away by our phantom apologist by saying that sometimes God blesses us so hard that it's evidence for God, and we have to pray because we just don't have the words. So what the fuck are we going to say in the prayer? And more importantly, regression to the mean. Now, I'm not a regression to the mean expert or anything, but stuff averages out is the gist as I understand it. I usually hear it attributed to skills and things, which is fine, but I think we can all agree that we have good days, bad days, but generally we have meh days, and that's where the mean is. That means that there's as much space in either direction for good and bad things as there are levels with which to categorize them. Call it negative infinity to positive infinity of your favorite kind of infinity, and all of our experiences happen on either side of that middle point. So here's the comeback for that. On a scale of the from and including the worst thing to and including the best thing, that is where all the things can and do happen. For every experience that can happen up to this point in time, it has. This means that good and bad things, serendipitous things, coincidences just happen. We don't need a wizard. They're necessary to have happened if they can have happened given enough chances. And given the amount of people that have been, I think it's fair to say that there's basically been all the chances for all the things that can happen to happen. So, no, much like the last footnote, things don't require worship and God. Things happen, and in a system with varying pleasures and pain values, they're going to happen given enough chances. To put it the way an apologist can understand, given enough tornadoes in that junkyard, you will get a 747 if it's possible to get a 747. You just might need a near forever amount of tornadoes. Back to the Bible. They offer Eliezer food, and he says no because he has an errand. Laban tells Eliezer to say what's up, and so Eliezer does. He tells them about why he's there, and Laban says that sounds totes cool. I mean, I say that really dismissively, but he's just retelling the story. And she showed up wearing maybe engagement stuff, so Laban probably might have figured out what was going on. I mean, Eliezer follows that up by asking Laban to tell him if he can turn to the right hand or the left, which is just a way of saying, did I fail at my task of buying a maybe baby? And I didn't check because it doesn't really seem like a cultural tradition kind of thing that would be very interesting in any level. So Laban and Bethuel told Eliezer that because the quest comes from the Lord, with all caps, which does it? I distinctly remember it coming from Abraham. They can't say no. So they sent Rebekah off with Eliezer and her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men and blessed Rebekah. Now, I skipped like 6 verses because it's just shit they give her and Eliezer getting a snotty about them not getting in the way after they said they wouldn't get in the way. It is straight up. All right, thank you for buying Rebekah. I won't get in your way. You had better not get in the way of Eliezer, the servant of the mighty Abraham. Yep, I already said I wouldn't. Do not stand in my way. It's a weird little aside in the story. So the blessing she got on her way out the door was, our sister may become the mother of thousands of 10,000s and may her descendants possess the gates of those who hate them, which is a terrible blessing. The mother of thousands of 10,000s, here's the thing, we already know, spoiler alert, she dies in her, mid-early hundreds. So they're being pretty fast and loose with mother here. And the whole thing seems to come back to the idea that her purpose is to live through her descendants. Because if we take either age, she has exclusively triplets. That's still 10 months gestation for 3 kids per year with a fifth of pregnancy left over. That's 3 and a partial child a year. That's only a couple hundred kids. So that's cool. Living through your descendants like that. I mean, that's cool for all of people, because that's what we all do, because I don't know, get a hobby, bust a nut, nobody exists on purpose, eventually we all die. But before you bust a nut, get consent. Don't be like Isaac. And you know what? While we're here, check in on occasion. Be a gentle person. See how they're doing. See if there's anything you could change up, anything they'd like you to cut out. See if they're getting close. Do they like the rhythm? Do they like what's going on? Check in on them during. And always respect the safe word. So the chapter ends when they head home. Rebekah sees Isaac, so she puts on her hood, and so Isaac fucks her and felt better after his mom died. Oh, Isaac, hero of religion, drowning his sorrows in a maybe toddler, maybe 14-year-old, maybe didn't exist. The real hero of the modern church. So in chapter 24, we see Abraham telling Eliezer to take off and get Isaac a bride, which he does by tricking her with camels, and so he owns her now. She may have been a toddler, might have been a teenager, probably didn't exist as written, and the moral of the story is kidnap children from your family if you want your kid to get married, which is a terrifying moral because, damn it, aren't they always, though? I think the real moral of the episode, though, should be life is meaningless, bust a nut, but get consent first and check in during. And in addition to that, or in lieu of that, get a hobby. I have been the High Apostate, and the Patreon and show notes are in the show notes. And who even knows what the next episode will be? I do, and you do too if you follow me on Patreon, or at Twitter, at the letter X Essential Panda, or the show at @apostasypowered, or send me emails to tell me I'm handsome at poweredbyapostasy@gmail.com, or hate mail at mcconnell.senate.gov/public/index.cfm. Unless it turns out I'm not allowed to have my hate mail sent to Mitch McConnell, in which case that was a joke, and the hate mail email is also poweredbyapostasy@gmail.com.